often comes with conditions. Jasmine looked straight into the camera and shattered decades of Western double standards. Africa doesn't need saving. It needs to be heard, she said. What did she say that united millions, enraged political elites? And why is America still trying to bury her words? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. In the heart of Ouagadougou, as the morning heat rippled off the palace courtyard, President Ibrahim Traoré paced his study, like a man with too many battles and not enough time. His cotton tunic clung to his back, damp with the sweat of a sleepless night spent decoding yet another foreign policy trap disguised as aid. On the desk in front of him lay a red folder marked URGENT in bold. Inside, a brief note from the Foreign Ministry, a video call scheduled for 10:30 a.m. with U.S. Representative Jasmine Crockett. No context, no warning, just a name. He scowled, not because he feared the conversation, but because he recognized the play. A black congresswoman, likely sent to soften the tone, to give the illusion of parody while pressing the same imperial demands behind polite language. Another face, he muttered, another mask for the same game. His chief advisor, Minister Coulibaly, entered without knocking, a tablet in hand and eyebrows already raised. "Sir, this is a soft call," he said, scrolling. "It's listed under agricultural cooperation. Nothing strategic, just optics." Traoré shot him a look that could freeze lava. "Optics," he repeated. "That's how colonialism dresses in the 21st century. In meetings, in memos, in smiles." He snapped the folder shut. "Set the camera in the study. No media, no briefing. I'll face her alone." Coulibaly hesitated. He knew that tone. It was the one Traoré used just before doing something that made Washington and Paris lose sleep. "Very well," he said. But even as he left, he cast a last glance at the folder. Jasmine Crockett. The name lingered like a match waiting for fuel. In Washington, the sky was steel gray and heavy, as if the city itself knew something was coming. Inside a cramped makeshift studio 3 blocks from the Capitol, Jasmine Crockett sat alone at a folding table, a cold cup of coffee beside her and a single overhead bulb casting sharp shadows on the wall. Her team had already left the room, giving her space, but the silence was louder than applause. Just 48 hours earlier, she'd been shredded by national media for speaking out against conditional aid to Africa. Headlines read like slaps. Crockett undermines U.S. interests. Congresswoman defends authoritarianism abroad. Is this who we send to represent us? It wasn't just pundits. Allies had gone quiet. Colleagues whispered in hallways. Donors ghosted her calls. And yet, here she was, minutes away from a direct line to the president of a nation at the center of the storm. She stared at the printed remarks in front of her, every word polished, approved, and dripping with neutrality. Economic collaboration, agricultural advancement, strategic dialogue. It was diplomatic anesthetic, written to please everyone and say nothing. Jasmine's jaw clenched. Her fingers hovered over the pages, then slowly pushed them aside. "I'm not here to lie for comfort," she whispered to herself. "I'm not here to protect systems that never protected me." She stood up, adjusted her blazer, and stared at her reflection in the black screen of the disconnected monitor. Behind her eyes burned the fury of 1,000 dismissals, 1,000 moments where being correct wasn't enough because she wasn't white, wasn't safe, wasn't silent. The world expected her to fold. Instead, she was about to set fire. She wasn't there to soothe egos. She was there to make someone listen, really listen. And she knew the moment the screen turned on, there would be no turning back. The screen blinked awake with a soft tone, but the tension arrived like a drumbeat. On one side of the call, President Ibrahim Traoré sat at an old wooden desk, the light from his tall window casting long shadows across the room. His face was still, sharp, unreadable. The face of a man used to being studied, not surprised. Behind him stood a quiet line of aides, one with a folder of policy notes, another adjusting the volume on the translator's headset. The protocol officer gave a slight nod, signaling the meeting was officially in session. Across the screen, Jasmine Crockett appeared seated in a plain room with a dusty blue backdrop and the soft glow of an overhead light. She didn't look rehearsed. She looked ready. Her hands were folded neatly, but her eyes betrayed something deeper. The steady pressure of being underestimated too many times by too many rooms like this. A staff voice broke the silence. "Congresswoman Crockett, the floor is yours." Jasmine gave a polite smile, not warm, but respectful, and reached toward the stack of printed remarks in front of her. For half a second, it looked like she might follow the script. Her fingers touched the edge of the first page. Then calmly, almost gently, she slid the entire stack to the side. The camera caught every motion. One of Traoré's aides stiffened. The translator hesitated, unsure if he'd missed something. But Jasmine's expression didn't change. She looked straight into the camera and began to speak. "Mr. President," she said, her voice low, firm, and so calm it demanded attention. "I was given prepared remarks today. Safe words, diplomatic phrases, the usual." She gave a small pause, just long enough to make it clear she was choosing a different path. "But I'm not going to read them, because those words weren't written for you. They were written to keep things comfortable for people back home." Her gaze never drifted. "I believe you deserve more than that, and I believe the people watching deserve more than that too." The room on both sides of the screen froze, not in confusion, but in recognition. Something unscripted was happening, and in diplomacy, that's the same as setting off a flare in a minefield. The protocol officer lowered his pen. The translator cleared his throat but said nothing, and Jasmine went on, not louder, but deeper. "I know I was supposed to talk about trade agreements and aid packages today, but I think we've had enough of speeches that say nothing. I came here to speak plainly, person to person, leader to leader, no filter, no mask." She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't performing, but something about the way she spoke, steady, unshaking, full of choice, made the air feel tighter, as if the call had just shifted from a formality into a moment that might actually matter. And just like that, the room shifted. Not with sound, but with a silence so sharp it felt like the air itself had been cut in half. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from confusion. It was the kind that came from impact. The kind that falls when someone says something no one dared to say, but everyone needed to hear. Jasmine didn't move. Her hands stayed on the desk, her fingers spread, her posture upright and calm, but the energy behind her eyes burned like a controlled fire. She had rehearsed a dozen lines the night before, lines meant to be safe, diplomatic, forgettable, but she'd just tossed them into the wind. And now she was free. Her voice didn't need to be loud. It was honest, and that made it thunder. "Mr. President," she said slowly, each word weighed, deliberate, "I need you to understand something from the start. I'm not here to clean up anyone's image. I'm not here to sell the idea that America is doing Africa a favor." She leaned forward, the tension in her shoulders finally released, not because she was at ease, but because the truth was finally being spoken. "I came here to ask something that no one in my government seems willing to ask you directly. Something simple, something overdue." Her eyes didn't flinch. "Why is it that we, America, always talk about helping you, but never stop to ask what you actually want?" The words didn't just hang in the air. They pressed down. On both ends of the call, heads turned. Aides looked at each other with frozen expressions, unsure whether to take notes or take cover. The translator swallowed hard before repeating her words, slowly, carefully, like he was handling glass. One of Traoré's policy advisors shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The protocol officer, halfway through a note, stopped writing entirely. It was as if the walls themselves were listening. Jasmine continued, her voice growing firmer but never losing control. "We love to talk about aid packages and partnerships, but too often what we're offering is not really partnership. It's control, painted over with the brush of generosity. We attach strings. We demand conditions. We tell you how to spend it, who to work with, what to allow and what to refuse. That's not support. That's manipulation." Her jaw tightened. "And then we wonder why the trust between our nations feels so thin." Still no one spoke. No one dared. The oxygen in the room felt charged. She had cut through decades of political performance with one sharp, unfiltered truth. And the impact was immediate. Not theatrical, not dramatic, just undeniable. Jasmine wasn't delivering a speech anymore. She was delivering a reckoning. The silence still clung to every corner of the screen, but Jasmine wasn't done, not even close. She inhaled slowly, as if pulling the weight of history into her lungs, and then she began again, not with anger, but with a steady fire. "I didn't walk into this meeting blind, Mr. President," she said, her voice calm but unmistakably fierce. "I didn't just read the one-page summary they gave me in the morning briefing. I didn't memorize a few facts so I could sound smart for the camera. I studied." Her hands open slightly on the desk, like she was laying something sacred down. "I stayed up reading stories about your people, your land, your struggle. Not because I had to, but because I needed to. Because the first time I saw your name in a headline, you weren't being praised. You were being ridiculed, labeled as reckless, dangerous, a threat to stability." She scoffed quietly. But whose stability were they really talking about? She paused, letting the question sting before she answered it herself. "Because the more I read, the clearer it became. You were doing something rare. You were saying no." Her voice tightened with purpose. "You said no to IMF loans dressed up as generosity. No to the kind of aid that shows up with a smile and a contract written in chains. No to the idea that Africa should be grateful to receive what it never asked for in the first place. And you didn't say it with bitterness. You said it with clarity, with purpose, with backbone." She leaned forward now as if to shorten the distance between continents. "And then I found myself falling deeper into the story of a man your people still whisper about with both sorrow and pride. Thomas Sankara." Her tone shifted, lower, more reverent. "He didn't just speak of freedom, he lived it. He made his cabinet drive second-hand cars. He banned government perks. He planted trees to fight desertification when others planted deals to collect bribes. He told the world, we must dare to invent the future, and for that he was silenced." She let the word hang for a full breath. Assassinated, not just by bullets, but by the fear he triggered in those who profited from African silence. The words came slower now, but heavier. "When I realized you had chosen to follow that same path, not perfectly but fearlessly, I understood something else. Why people back home are so quick to label you a radical. Why the media barely reports what you're building, but never misses a chance to amplify what you're refusing." She looked directly into the lens. "Because you're not just challenging policies. You're challenging power, the kind that has gotten too used to speaking and never being questioned." She pressed her lips together for a second, then added with a quieter force, "Back in Washington, I got told to be careful even saying your name. It might send the wrong message," they said. "He's not an ally." But they never asked me what kind of message I wanted to send. They just assumed I'd stay in line, that I'd smile, shake hands, and protect the same systems that have never protected people who look like me, or like you. They warned me, Mr. President, but they didn't understand. I wasn't afraid of backlash. I was afraid of silence." She paused again, heart steady, but her throat tight with meaning. "That's why I'm here. Not to praise you blindly, not to play politics, but because when I saw the way you stood alone, I realized I had to stand too." The room on the other end remained frozen. No notes taken, no whispers. Even the translator's voice, when he repeated her words, had softened, as if he too understood that this was no longer a conversation. This was something closer to truth. The truth she had just spoken didn't echo. It settled, like dust after a battlefield roar. But instead of retreating, Jasmine pressed forward, knowing this was the moment she had cracked the silence wide open. "Mr. President," she said, her tone dropping into something sharper, something almost defiant, "you've done what too many of our leaders, my leaders, don't have the courage to do." She didn't blink. "You chose people over profit, dignity over dollars. You put your citizens ahead of your comfort, your career, your reputation in foreign media." Her hand pressed firmly on the table now, fingers tense. "And for that, they call you unstable. For that, they warn us not to get too close." She leaned in, voice steady but rising like a tide. "But what if the real instability is leadership that's afraid to make that same choice? Across the screen, something changed. Ibrahim Traoré, who had sat like stone since the beginning, slowly leaned forward. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to show that he was no longer listening like a politician, but like a man hearing something he hadn't dared to hope for. His advisors exchanged glances, unsure if they should intervene, but he didn't wave them off. He didn't move at all. His eyes were fixed on Jasmine now, focused in a way that said, "This isn't noise. This is new." And Jasmine, seeing it, that quiet shift in his posture, that subtle crack in the armor, didn't back off. She took a breath and let her next sentence hit like thunder on steel. "You reminded me what leadership is supposed to look like, and it doesn't look like power. It looks like sacrifice." And just when it seemed she had said the boldest thing anyone on that call had ever heard, Jasmine stopped. Not because she was unsure, but because the moment demanded silence before truth. Her hands rested lightly on the desk in front of her, the edge of a page still visible beneath her fingers, though she hadn't looked at it in minutes. She let the quiet stretch, not to fill space, but to make room. Room for something that couldn't be softened. Something that needed to land with the full weight of history, injustice, and raw, unfiltered honesty. She inhaled once, held it, then let the words go like a blade loosed from its sheath. "Africa doesn't need saving," she said, her voice steady, clear, and stripped of any performance. "Africa needs to be heard." The sentence didn't rise. It fell, like stone into still water, sinking deep with a gravity no one could deny. The translator on the other side of the screen blinked, visibly startled. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then glanced toward the protocol officer beside him. Even he seemed unsure whether to repeat it, not because the words were unclear, but because they were too clear, because they broke a script everyone else had agreed, silently to follow. When he finally translated it, he spoke slower than before. His voice was low, deliberate, almost reverent, as if repeating something sacred he wasn't prepared for. Around President Traoré, tension rippled like a wave under glass. Advisors exchanged alarmed glances, eyes wide, lips pressed tight. One of them subtly reached for his tablet, already imagining the headlines. "American Congresswoman defies protocol on diplomatic call." Another leaned toward the communications chief, whispering something no one could hear but everyone could feel. "This is going to explode. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. This call was scheduled as routine, symbolic, safe, but the moment refused to be safe. And then, in the eye of that quiet storm, the only movement came not from panic, but from the president himself." Slowly, Ibrahim Traoré's hands, once calmly resting on the desk, curled into fists. Not with rage, with something far more dangerous to those in power. Truth that finally found its mark. His jaw tightened. His shoulders drew back. He didn't speak, didn't blink. But his eyes told the story. Tears began to form. He blinked once, slow, uncertain. And then another tear welled up behind it, as if pushed forward not by emotion alone, but by memory, by fatigue, by the echo of years spent fighting to be seen as something other than a recipient, a subordinate, a footnote in someone else's narrative. And now across an ocean, a single woman had said aloud what no ally, no donor, no diplomat had ever dared. "You don't need to be saved. You need to be heard." And he heard it. One tear slid down his cheek, carving a quiet path through the hardened surface of a man known for military strength and political defiance. His chest rose slowly, the breath deeper than any that had come before it. In front of his entire team, in front of the world, the president of Burkina Faso wept. Not in weakness, not in shame, but in the rare sacred grief of a man who had fought every day to prove his people's worth. And finally, someone had said they mattered. No one moved. No one dared speak. It was as if the call had transformed from a diplomatic exchange into something closer to holy. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't fill the space. She let it breathe, because she knew this wasn't the moment for more words. This was the moment truth had landed. But no silence lasts forever. And as the final frame of the video call faded to black, Jasmine Crockett's calm defiance gave way to a tidal wave of fury across the American political landscape. It didn't take hours, it took minutes. By the time Jasmine had stepped out of her office and exhaled the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, the knives were already out. The first blow came from Capitol Hill. Senator Alan McKean, a Republican heavyweight with decades of media grooming, went live on Fox News and staring cold into the camera. "This congresswoman," he said, voice smooth like poison, "chose to embarrass the United States in front of a barely elected strongman. That wasn't diplomacy. That was self-aggrandizement wrapped in a TED Talk." The clip spread fast, clipped into 30-second outrage bites. On Twitter, pundits called her performance unprofessional, reckless, and a national disgrace. On AM radio, her name was mentioned more than the president's. Commentators accused her of being a mouthpiece for Marxists, a symbol of woke foreign policy, and one host snarled, "She sounds more like a spokesperson for Africa than a representative of Texas." It didn't stop there. Conservative memes flooded social media, her face photoshopped beside dictators, her speech twisted into slogans like "Jasmine for Burkina 2024. One popular right-wing influencer called her the Angela Davis of foreign betrayal. Congressional colleagues whispered behind closed doors. Reporters waited outside her office like vultures circling a wounded animal. Even within her own party, some Democrats privately winced. "She went too far," one aide told Politico off the record. "You don't slap Washington while you're still sitting in it." But even as the ridicule reached a fever pitch, something strange and powerful began to unfold. Jasmine's words refused to die. In Nairobi, her speech was rebroadcast in full, uninterrupted, with voiceover translations in 3 languages. In Lagos, youth-led radio stations replayed the line, "Africa doesn't need saving, it needs to be heard," over Afrobeat instrumentals, turning it into a protest anthem. In Johannesburg, university students projected her face onto campus buildings, calling her the voice we've been waiting for. In Harlem, community leaders replayed her speech during church gatherings and town halls. The clip reached South Central LA, Atlanta barbershops, Baltimore high schools. It wasn't just going viral. It was spreading like truth, finally finding ears that had waited too long. And it wasn't just Africa. It was every neighborhood that had ever been ignored. Every community that had been spoken about, but never spoken to. Jasmine's inbox exploded with emails from people she'd never met. Students, mothers, teachers, immigrants, prison inmates. Each one echoing the same message. "Thank you for saying what we've always felt, but were never allowed to speak." A single mother from Houston wrote, "You made me believe again, not in politics, in dignity." The more the machine tried to crush her, the more human she became. Not perfect, not polished, but real. And somehow that was more dangerous to the system than anything she'd said on camera. Because Jasmine Crockett had done what few dared. She'd looked power in the face and said, "You're not the only voice that matters anymore." They wanted her silenced. Instead, they made her impossible to ignore. And while Jasmine Crockett's speech raged like a wildfire through political halls and public squares across the Atlantic, something quieter was unfolding. Something no camera crew followed, no headline chased, but something just as explosive in the soul of a nation. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't notify his ministers. He didn't call his press secretary. He left no public itinerary, just a short, hushed word to his aide. "Take me to Tambaga, a remote village in the southeast of Burkina Faso, known not for politics but for millet fields, cracked roads, and people who understood dignity not as an idea, but as a necessity." He wore a plain tunic, no tailored suit, no military insignia, and stepped into a dusty, sun-aged Jeep with only a driver and one silent bodyguard. As they left the capital behind, the world of protocols and press briefings dissolved into orange earth, whispering wind, and the long ache of memory. The journey was long and silent. The air outside shimmered with heat, and as the wheels bumped along dried-out roads, Traoré sat quietly in the back seat, one hand resting on the window ledge, the other on his knee. His mind wasn't on policy. It wasn't on the backlash Jasmine was facing in America. It was on the moment her voice, firm, unwavering, had pierced a veil he had long accepted as unchangeable. Africa doesn't need saving, it needs to be heard. The words played over and over in his head, like a song too true to forget. When they finally arrived, the jeep rolled slowly into the village's edge. There was no security perimeter, no brass band, just silence. And then a slow ripple of motion, curious heads turning from doorways, children pausing their play, elders rising from woven mats beneath baobab trees. They hadn't been told he was coming, but somehow the village seemed to know. Perhaps they sensed something. Perhaps in a country where history too often arrives as silence or fire, they had learned to feel moments before they were spoken. He stepped down onto the red dust, his sandals landing softly. A small group gathered, not out of duty, but out of reverence. The president wasn't flanked by soldiers or advisors. He walked alone. And as he passed the rows of quiet faces, he nodded not as a ruler, but as a man returning to something essential. From among the crowd, a child stepped forward. He was small, no older than 7 or 8, barefoot, with a shirt too large for his frame, and eyes that held no fear. His name was Tano. In his hands, wrapped in a piece of faded cloth, was a small wooden object, its corners poking out just enough to reveal it had been carved by hand. The crowd parted instinctively, as if they understood the gravity of the gesture without needing explanation. Tano walked slowly, deliberately, until he stood in front of Traoré. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. One man who carried the weight of a country, one boy too young to understand politics, but wise enough to feel truth. Then silently, the boy extended the bundle. Traoré bent down, not with ceremony, but with something deeper. His knees met the dirt. He unwrapped the cloth gently. Inside was a sculpture, carved from dark rosewood. 2 figures, simple and stylized. One tall, one small. Their hands clasped tightly. The larger leaned down slightly. The smaller leaned upward, as if the weight of the world was being shared between them. At the base, chiseled carefully, were 3 words in French: La gentillesse unit les mondes. Kindness unites worlds. The president didn't speak, not at first. He traced the edges of the sculpture with his thumb. The wood was rough in places, smoothed in others. A child's work, yes, but also a message. Not filtered through speechwriters or campaign slogans. Not planned, not manipulated. This was unfiltered, undiluted truth. And then the tears came. They surprised even him. They weren't the tears of politics or grief. They were something more primal, a wave of emotion that had been building for years, decades, under layers of resilience and responsibility. His shoulders trembled, his lips pressed tight. He didn't wipe the tears away. He let them fall, slow and quiet, carving their own path down his face like rain on stone. No one moved. The villagers stood still, eyes wide, hearts thunderstruck. They had seen their president speak to foreign leaders, walk across battlefields, stand stoic through droughts and conflict. But they had never seen him like this, raw, human, humbled. Tano didn't flinch. He watched, not confused, but with a strange serenity, as if some part of him knew this was what the man needed. Not applause, not power, but release. He took a step closer. The president, still kneeling, looked up at him. Tano reached out and touched his arm. She said, "You made us feel heard," the boy whispered. Traoré nodded slowly, trying to speak but unable to find words. He looked around at the village, the cracked homes, the bare feet, the worn tools, but also the eyes. The eyes were lit up, not with pity, with pride. And in that moment, Ibrahim Traoré realized something Jasmine had already known. Power isn't in what you build, but in who you see. Eventually he stood, the sculpture still in his hand. He didn't say anything grand, no speech, no declarations, but he turned to his aide and said softly, "I want this placed on my desk. Not the gold plaque, not the flag. This. Let this remind me what I'm really carrying." And with that, he walked back toward the jeep, his eyes red, his pace slow, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. That evening, as the sun sank low over Tembaga and villagers returned to their homes, Tano sat under the baobab tree, with his older sister. He didn't say much, just held the cloth the sculpture had been wrapped in. His sister asked, "Do you think he liked it?" Tano didn't smile. He just looked toward the road where the dust still hovered in the air and said, "I think he needed it." And miles away, as the Capitol lights flickered on and the city resumed its rhythm, President Traoré sat alone in his private study. The sculpture now rested at the center of his desk. He didn't turn on the news. He didn't pick up his phone. He just sat back in his chair, eyes locked on those two wooden figures. One big, one small, hand in hand. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. Not as a leader, but as a man who had finally been heard. The lights inside the studio were cold, almost surgical. Not the warmth of stage lights designed to flatter, but the kind that exposed everything. The cameras were already rolling when Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the set. She adjusted her mic herself. No handler, no fuss. Just her, a chair, and the unmistakable air of someone walking into a lion's den and refusing to flinch. Across the table sat the host, polished, practiced, and perfectly rehearsed. He shuffled his cue cards as if the performance hadn't already begun. He wasn't here to learn, he was here to corner. The moment Jasmine settled in, the lights dimmed slightly and a red dot on the camera came alive like a signal flare. "Congresswoman Crockett," the host began with a saccharine tone, "you've had quite a week. Viral fame, global headlines, and no shortage of criticism, particularly from those in your own country. So let me ask you what everyone's wondering. If you could go back, knowing all the backlash your words would cause, would you still say them?" The room tightened. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't blink. She didn't try to soften her posture for the audience. Her voice came slowly at first, not out of hesitation, but with the kind of precision a surgeon uses when making the first cut. "Let me be clear," she said, locking eyes not with the host, but with the camera, with the millions of people watching from their homes, phones, and classrooms. "I didn't speak to win applause. I didn't speak to make headlines. I spoke because silence is too damn expensive." The host shifted slightly. The camera zoomed in. Jasmine's voice deepened, not louder, just heavier. "I didn't praise President Traoré because he wears a title. I praised him because, in a world drowning in ego, he chose something rare: service. He stood up to institutions we all know are rigged against countries like his. He put books in the hands of children instead of debt on their future, and that scared people, because it reminds us what we're not doing." She let the silence stretch. Then her tone turned sharper. "If people are uncomfortable with what I said, maybe the real discomfort isn't about my words. Maybe it's about the mirror those words hold up. Maybe it forces them to ask a question they've been avoiding for years. Who are we really serving?" The host raised a hand trying to interject, but Jasmine didn't stop. "We send aid with strings. We give with one hand and take with the other. We dress it up in language like partnership and stability, but it's control. And the minute someone, especially someone from a place like Burkina Faso, says no thank you, suddenly they're a threat, a dictator, a danger to democracy." She shook her head. Calm, precise. "I praised a man not for his office, but for his courage. And if that rattles people in power, maybe that says more about their insecurity than my integrity." The tension was electric. The crew behind the camera stopped moving. Even the floor manager, usually signaling timing cues, stood frozen. Jasmine leaned forward now, lowering her voice just enough to draw the listener in closer. "We've built a political culture so obsessed with optics that we've forgotten how to recognize truth when it's spoken plainly. We mock sincerity, we punish honesty. And God forbid a black woman speaks boldly in an international setting. Suddenly, it's betrayal." Now her eyes locked on the host just for a beat. "You asked me if I'd do it again," she said. "And the answer is yes, every time. Because telling the truth about dignity shouldn't be a career risk. It should be the job." She exhaled slowly, not with fatigue, but with release. "I won't apologize for giving credit where it's due. And if my country is more offended by my praise of justice than by its neglect of it, then we have bigger problems than one speech." The studio was still. The host tried to smile, but it came out crooked, unsure. Jasmine didn't wait for another question. She folded her hands in front of her, eyes steady, voice quiet but unshakable. I've sat in rooms where my presence was tolerated but not welcomed. I've heard whispers about being too emotional, too passionate, too much. And I've learned they don't fear my words. They fear the possibility that someone might believe them, that someone might look up and say, if she can speak like that, maybe I can too. She paused. Maybe that's what scares them the most. The segment cut to commercial, but the moment wouldn't fade. It was already being clipped, captioned, shared in real time. And Jasmine? She sat back in her chair, unmoved by the heat around her. She hadn't just defended herself. She had lit a fire. The sun blazed over Ouagadougou like a silent sentinel, casting a golden hue across the plaza that had never held so many people. Not for a concert, not for a military parade, not even for a holiday. This was different. There was no choreography, no brass band, no parade of armored SUVs, just people. Ordinary citizens standing in stillness, under fraying umbrellas, behind makeshift fences, and on rooftops, all gathered for one reason, to witness the birth of something they'd never been promised. They weren't waiting for handouts. They weren't waiting for foreign dignitaries or fat envelopes of aid. They were waiting for acknowledgement, for a signal that this time things might actually change, and that change might come from within. On the makeshift stage stood a structure covered in canvas. Behind it, hidden from the crowd's view, technicians in simple black t-shirts were fumbling with a dusty projector and frayed cords. The heat made the equipment cranky, the screen sweat-stained. But finally, after a small crackle of static and the flicker of a loading bar, the giant screen came to life. Gasps moved through the crowd like a ripple on water. It was her, Jasmine Crockett, projected 40 feet high, broadcast from her congressional office in Washington. Her figure looked both distant and familiar, like a long-lost relative speaking into the wind and somehow being heard across oceans. She wore no jewelry, no American flag pin, just a simple black blouse. But her posture, her gaze, that was unshakable. To the children of Burkina Faso, she began, her voice steady but intimate. To the teachers who keep showing up with no chalk. To the mothers who walk 6 miles just to enroll their daughters in school. To the fathers who stay up at night teaching their sons to read by candlelight. You are not invisible. The crowd didn't cheer. Not yet. They listened. Too often, she continued, the world writes your story for you. They write it in boardrooms, in Western capitals, in newspapers that will never print your names. They call you fragile. They call you poor. But what I saw when I met your president, what I saw when I studied your history, is not fragility. It's strength. It's resilience. It's a defiance that says, we will not be told who we are anymore. The silence deepened. Jasmine leaned slightly forward and her voice lowered. A little boy once gave me a sculpture, she said. 2 figures holding hands, one large, one small. Underneath it, he had carved 5 simple words. Kindness unites the world. She lifted the carving gently into frame, the same one Tano had given to President Traoré weeks before. Her fingers trembled just slightly. That boy, she said, may never know what he gave me. But I carry his gift every day because it reminds me what we forget too easily. Real power doesn't come from how much you can control. It comes from how deeply you can care. The camera held on her eyes for a second too long before the video faded to black. The screen went dark. No one moved. Not the girl in the front row clutching a borrowed notebook. Not the elder with the bent cane and glassy eyes. Not the security guard sweating through his uniform. Then came the first clap, then another, and another. And then it happened. A thunderous wave of applause exploded from the plaza like a storm that had waited years to break. Children shouted her name. Old women lifted their hands skyward. Men beat their chests in rhythm. Even those who didn't fully understand the language had understood something more powerful. They had been seen. From behind the curtain, President Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the sunlight. There was no teleprompter, no red carpet, no bodyguards flanking him. Just a man in a hand-woven tunic, his face carved with quiet disbelief. He didn't rush. He didn't wave. He walked slowly to the podium, letting the applause fill the space between his steps. And then he spoke. "She did not bring us promises," he said in French, voice husky with emotion. "She did not come offering contracts. She did not speak to us as if we were her students. She did not speak down to us." He paused, his eyes scanning the rows of children at the front. His gaze settled on a girl in a purple head wrap, no older than 10, sitting on her father's shoulders. "She did something more dangerous," he said softly. "She listened." A hush fell over the crowd again, not out of confusion, but reverence. "She reminded the world," he continued, "that we do not need pity. We do not need to be saved. We do not need more signatures on papers written in languages we do not speak." He stepped away from the microphone now, almost speaking to himself. "We need to be heard." The wind picked up then, fluttering the flags behind him. One of them tore slightly at the edge, but nobody looked away, because all eyes were still locked on him. "She did not flatter me because I am president," he added, his voice rising now. "She praised me because I chose to serve. I put clinics before contracts, schools before speeches, dignity before dollars." And then he did something no one expected. He stepped off the stage and walked directly into the crowd. People gasped. Security froze. But he walked to the girl in the purple head wrap. The same girl who had been watching Jasmine's video with wide, unblinking eyes. He bent down beside her, placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and whispered, "One day you will lead too." She nodded, lips trembling. He stood up again, turned back to the crowd and shouted, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." And the plaza, dusty, dry, exhausted, erupted once more. But this time, it wasn't applause, it was belief. While cameras in the Capitol were folding up and diplomats returned to scripted lives, in the dry red soil heart of Burkina Faso, belief had taken root, not in parliaments, but in the hands of children who didn't yet know they were shaping a nation. In a weathered classroom where light spilled through the slats in the wall, Ila sat on the far end of a splintered bench, her knees pressed tightly together, her lips murmuring as she rehearsed her handwriting. The air was still, thick with dust and the quiet shuffle of other students tracing letters into worn pages. There was no air conditioning, no smart boards, no glass windows, only hope pressed into the margins of old wood and thin paper. The notebook she held was still stiff from newness, the kind of new that makes children afraid to ruin it. But today she wasn't afraid. Today she was determined. Her pencil, already dulled to half its size, carved out each word like it mattered more than breath. "One day I will be a teacher, like the president." She paused after the final word, staring at it as though it had appeared by magic. And in a way, it had. Just weeks ago, she didn't know the president's name. Now she saw his image on posters near the market, not in a military uniform or hidden behind armored glass, but walking with children, shaking hands, visiting clinics. He smiled like a father, not a ruler. And when the teacher asked them who they wanted to become, Illa didn't hesitate. For the first time, her answer wasn't nurse or mother or I don't know. It was leader. Not because someone told her to say it, but because she had seen it done with kindness. Meanwhile, under a neem tree just beyond the schoolyard, a smaller girl named Nima sat cross-legged, alone. Her dress was frayed, patched at the sides, and the soles of her feet were coated with fine red dust. In her lap rested a soft doll sewn from discarded cloth. One eye was a button, the other just black thread. She rocked it gently back and forth as if the doll were listening, and maybe it was. Her lips moved slowly, almost reverently, as she whispered, "Her name is Hope." Then more softly still, "Before I didn't know what to wish for. Now, I do." Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't ask permission. It was a truth so quiet it roared. The teacher, who had been watching from the doorway, turned away quickly, blinking back the sting in her eyes. She had seen many students pass through, some with promise, most with scars. But today, in the gaze of two little girls, one speaking her future aloud, the other whispering it into the lap of a doll, she saw something else. She saw what policy alone could never create. She saw dignity, and she felt, with a bone-deep certainty, that something sacred had begun. Back in the classroom, Illa raised her hand. The teacher, startled, nodded. Illa stood, cleared her throat, and read her sentence aloud. Her voice was steady, strong for a girl her age. "When I grow up, I want to be a teacher like the president." The room fell silent. Even the usual whispers stopped. Not because the sentence was strange, but because it wasn't. It made sense now. For the first time, her dream belonged. The other students clapped, not mechanically, but with joy. Some laughed shyly, others glanced at their own notebooks, wondering what they might write next. The boy sitting beside her leaned in and asked if she thought boys could become presidents who cared too. She nodded without hesitation. "If they listen first," she said. The world had not changed with legislation. It had not changed with speeches. It had changed when a little girl in a forgotten village believed she was seen and knew that her voice might matter, not someday, but now. That morning, when she had walked to school, Illa had passed goats, quiet trees, and women drawing water from a cracked cement well. But she had also passed a poster taped to the wall of a bakery, faded by sun, showing a screenshot from the national education launch. On it, the president standing on stage, and Jasmine Crockett smiling from a screen behind him. Her mother had paused in front of the poster. "She's the one who didn't give us money," she murmured. "She gave us something harder. She gave us a question." Illa didn't understand the full meaning then, but she remembered it as she wrote her sentence. And now, as her classmates whispered about their own dreams, she finally knew what her mother meant. Meanwhile, outside, Nima tucked her doll beneath her shawl. Her whisper had not been recorded. No reporter would write about it. But if the president had been there, if Jasmine Crockett had heard it, they would have understood. Because that whisper about dreams, about hope, was the whole revolution in miniature. Politics hadn't arrived with marching bands or foreign advisors. It had arrived in the fingertips of children writing on lined paper. It arrived in the imagination of a girl who believed leadership was not about speaking loudly. It was about hearing the quiet, while children in rural villages whispered dreams they didn't know they were allowed to have. And the quiet weight of hope began settling over Burkina Faso like early morning mist. Somewhere far away, in the polished, sterilized air of a Washington, D.C. studio, Jasmine Crockett prepared to speak her final truth. The camera's red light blinked to life. Across the table sat one of America's most prominent political interviewers, a man known more for interruptions than insight. A man who had grilled presidents, humiliated governors, and once made a senator walk off set. Jasmine didn't flinch. She wore no designer jacket, no media-polished smile, just a quiet defiance and the kind of fire that doesn't scream but sears. "Congresswoman Crockett," the host said slowly, carefully, like winding up a trap, "if you could go back, knowing how many feathers you ruffled, the international headlines, the scathing op-eds, would you still say those words to President Traoré?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. Then she leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked onto the lens. "Because I didn't praise him for being a president. I praised him for something far more rare, for putting his people before power." The host blinked, stunned. The crew behind the cameras paused. This wasn't a political answer. It was a line carved in steel, and she didn't stop. "See, in this town," she continued, voice tightening, "we romanticize silence. We dress it up as strategy. We call it decorum when we avoid hard truths. But I won't apologize for saying that listening, truly listening, to Africa is more revolutionary than all the money we've ever thrown at her." She paused just long enough to let the weight settle. "And if that makes some of my colleagues uncomfortable, maybe they should ask themselves what comfort is costing the rest of the world." The air turned electric. No scripted soundbite, no party-tested phrase, just truth. Raw, unvarnished, and aimed like a scalpel. The segment aired uncut. Within an hour, it had been shared over 4 million times. By midnight, young activists were quoting her line in videos. By morning, the walls of local high schools bore the words in spray-painted letters, "Power doesn't serve people. People serve people." Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, the presidential residence stood silent against the backdrop of a rising sun. Inside, Ibrahim Traoré moved with purpose, but not for cameras. He wore no sash, no medals, only a simple tunic. The sculpture Tano had given him rested on a table nearby, polished now from being held so often. He stared at it again that morning, as if still trying to understand how such small hands could carry such an enormous message. And in that moment, far from applause or policy memos, he whispered not for a crowd, but for history itself. We did it. He didn't mean politics. He meant something older, something nobler. The moment when a leader becomes more than a title, when they become the echo of their people's quietest hopes. In a village dozens of miles away, the morning bell rang at a modest primary school built with local hands and international doubt. Children shuffled in with second-hand notebooks and third-generation uniforms. Among them was a girl named Adama. She had never spoken to the president. She didn't know who Jasmine Crockett was, but she sat at her desk like it was a throne. When she opened her brand-new textbook, the smell of fresh paper filled her nose. And there it was, a message stamped on the first page in thick black ink. For those who believe that dignity can change the world. She read it once, then again, slowly. She didn't know what dignity fully meant, but somehow she understood it. It felt like the difference between being helped and being seen, between receiving and mattering. And in that exact moment, with a broken pencil and an unsteady hand, she began to write her story. Not the one assigned, but the one she was born to tell. Back in Washington, Jasmine sat backstage after the interview, head bowed, palms flat on her lap. Her team had filed out. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant rhythm of a city that still didn't know what to make of her. On the table beside her lay a small carved replica of the Tano sculpture. Someone had mailed it anonymously with no return address. Just a sticky note, "You gave us permission to believe." Jasmine picked it up, turned it in her hands. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But something inside her settled, like the sound of a final puzzle piece clicking into place. The next day, at a newly opened public library in Baltimore, a mural was unveiled. It stretched across the entire back wall. Two figures, one large, one small, hands joined, standing not above the world but within it. Around them, trees bloomed from the ground. Books scattered like seeds, and painted across the top in bold brush strokes. Kindness unites worlds. No names, no politics, just the message. And every child who saw it knew. This wasn't about governments. This was about them. And so the story didn't end. Not with a vote, not with a treaty. It began again, quietly, steadily, in chalkboard lessons, in street corner poems. In the moment a child realizes their voice isn't too small to matter. Jasmine Crockett spoke one sentence, and it cracked something open in the world. And now from Washington to Ouagadougou, from Tano's carved hands to Adama's scribbled dreams, that crack had become a doorway. Through it, the future was walking in, one voice at a time. The video ended. The applause echoed across the plaza. But what came next was not celebration. It was silence. Not the silence of confusion, nor the stillness of fear, but a silence so full, so deliberate, it carried the weight of generations. Something had changed. In Washington, in Ouagadougou, in schoolyards and cabinet rooms, in refugee tents and academic halls. Something had shifted. Not because a policy was passed, not because a budget was approved, but because, for the first time in a long time, someone said the quiet part out loud and dared to believe that dignity, not dominance, could change the world. Jasmine Crockett had not traveled to make friends. She had not spoken to gain favor or appease institutions. She knew exactly what the cost would be. She had walked into a political hornet's nest with no armor but her conviction. And when she said, "Africa doesn't need saving, it needs to be heard," it wasn't a slogan. It was an unmasking, a direct challenge to every system that had built its empire on condescension, on presuming to know what people need without ever asking them what they want. That sentence hit harder than policy. It unsettled. It disrupted. Because it wasn't just about foreign aid. It was about the deeper sickness, the global habit of silencing the very people whose survival has required the most strength. And she said it calmly, without raising her voice, without pounding a podium. Because truth doesn't need volume, it just needs courage. In the days that followed, she was attacked, vilified, called reckless, radical, unpatriotic. A senator said she had humiliated the nation. A news host called her a mouthpiece for anti-Western propaganda. One pundit accused her of being more loyal to Burkina Faso than to Baltimore. They tried to paint her as a traitor, but they missed something vital. She wasn't speaking for another country. She was speaking for another future. And that future, they couldn't stop it, because it had already begun. It began the moment Tano handed President Traoré a wooden sculpture made by his own small hands. Two figures holding hands, one big, one small, and beneath it, 5 words that would ripple across continents. Kindness unites worlds. In that single object, carved not by power but by innocence, the world saw something no policy paper had ever captured: the humanity that exists beneath politics, the raw beauty of being seen. And suddenly, what Jasmine said didn't feel so radical anymore. It felt obvious. It felt overdue. Across Africa, the phrase began appearing on murals, on chalkboards, on signs at youth marches. In America, it showed up on protest posters, in spoken-word poems, in church sermons. Kindness unites worlds became more than a phrase. It became a North Star. In Oakland, a high school debate team opened their finals with Jasmine's speech. In Nairobi, a young girl wrote an essay titled, "What Would Happen If We Listened?" In Accra, a teacher gathered her students under a mango tree and played the clip on an old phone. When it ended, no one spoke for a long time, and then one child asked, "Why did it take this long?" That is the question. Why did it take this long for the world to treat dignity as policy? Why did it take this long to admit that service, not control, is the highest form of leadership? Why did it take one woman, standing alone, knowing she'd be punished, to remind the world that listening is not weakness, but revolution? And perhaps most powerfully, why did it take a little boy with a block of wood to show a president what legacy really looks like? In the end, Jasmine was not asking for applause. She was asking for accountability. She was asking leaders, all leaders, to choose courage over comfort. Not with grand gestures, but with simple truths. That serving people means actually serving them. That hearing a village is more powerful than conquering a country. That a girl with a notebook in a dusty classroom matters just as much as a banker in a glass tower. And that empathy, not ego, is what holds nations together. Back in Burkina Faso, President Traoré returned to his study. No cameras, no speeches, just him, alone, with the sculpture on his desk. He ran his fingers across the words again, not as a president, but as a man who had made mistakes, who had chosen hard roads, who had risked comfort for the kind of change that doesn't fit in headlines. And as he stared out the window at his country, poor in wealth, rich in heart, he whispered to no one, "We did it." And he was right, not because everything had changed, but because someone had finally said what needed to be said, and because someone else had listened. That's how change begins. It doesn't arrive in thunder. It doesn't scream through microphones. It starts in moments like this: a sentence spoken in defiance, a tear shed in quiet, a statue handed to a man who didn't expect to cry. And most of all, in the belief, however small, that the future can be different if we choose to hear one another. So what is the lesson? This: when dignity is no longer an afterthought, when we center it, protect it, live it, everything changes. Governments don't collapse, they evolve. Communities don't weaken, they rise. Children don't stay silent, they dream. And nations don't conquer, they listen. Because in the end, history doesn't remember those who shouted the loudest. It remembers those who spoke the clearest truth and paid the price for it. Jasmine Crockett did. So did Ibrahim Traoré. And so, now must we. And if history begins with a whisper, then what happens next depends on what we do after the silence. The story doesn't end with applause or a quote carved into wood. It continues only if we choose to carry its weight, if we turn belief into action and conviction into movement. This is the moment to decide. Not tomorrow. Not when the next election comes. Not when it's safe. Now because injustice thrives in delay. Because dignity dies in silence. Because every time we say, someone else will speak, we give power to those who have built entire empires on silence. Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for permission. Ibrahim Traoré didn't wait for applause. And the children of Burkina Faso didn't wait for hope to be handed to them. They made it themselves. So ask yourself, what are you waiting for? If you believe leadership should mean service, stand up. If you believe that people deserve to be heard, not managed, speak louder. If you've ever felt like your voice was too small, remember this story. One voice in Washington shook continents. One act of listening changed a nation. One act of courage from a child broke a president's heart open. And now it's your turn. Share this story. Start the conversation. Challenge the narratives that reduce entire countries to pity and leaders to puppets. Write, march, teach, vote, donate, protest, protect. Refuse to be silent when it matters most. Refuse to forget when the headlines move on. Because the world doesn't change when we watch. It changes when we act. And sometimes all it takes is one person, in the right moment, saying the hard thing, in a room that wasn't ready to hear it. Be that person, now before the silence returns. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In just 15 minutes on The View, Jasmine Crockett flipped the script on national television. Whoopi Goldberg tried to corner her, accusing Jasmine of using race and identity as weapons. But Jasmine fired back with a single unscripted line so raw, the entire studio froze. This wasn't a debate, it was a live ambush, and Jasmine turned it into a reckoning. What happens when the media's target fights back with the truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The invitation came just hours after Jasmine Crockett had dismantled a senior committee member during a tense congressional hearing. Her voice still echoed in the corridors, clear, unwavering, cutting through the political theater like a scalpel. She had exposed loopholes, challenged bias, and refused to let another sanitized narrative wash away systemic injustice. Cameras caught every second, but what they didn't catch was the weight on her shoulders, the exhaustion of always having to be twice as sharp just to be heard. Then came the email. The View invites representative Jasmine Crockett to appear on tomorrow's live broadcast. Producers at The View weren't subtle. They thought they were inviting a colorful firebrand, a congresswoman who went viral for throwing verbal punches. To them, Jasmine was clickbait, an unpredictable spark to stir drama between commercial breaks. They didn't see a legislator. They saw a trending moment waiting to be milked. One producer reportedly said, "She's hot right now, she'll boost ratings." What they didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett wasn't a sideshow. She wasn't there to perform outrage for applause. They had misread everything about her. She wasn't a woman you could use for a spectacle and dismiss the moment after. She wasn't walking into that studio to play their game. They invited a headline. But what they got was a reckoning. They thought they were summoning a storm. What they didn't know was, the storm had already arrived and it was sitting in the dressing room, silent, composed, and deadly calm. Backstage was colder than expected, and not just because of the air conditioning. There was a tension in the air that didn't belong to technical rehearsals or camera checks. It was the kind of cold that came from eyes that scanned without welcoming, from smiles that stopped at the lips and never reached the eyes. Jasmine Crockett sat beneath the glow of dressing room lights that should have made her feel like a guest, but instead felt like searchlights on a prisoner. The mirror in front of her reflected more than her makeup. It reflected a room full of people pretending not to stare, pretending they didn't already have a story to tell about her before she even opened her mouth. There were no warm greetings, no curious questions about her work in Congress. Only silence and an invisible script everyone seemed to be holding except her. A young production assistant passed by without stopping, murmuring just loud enough for someone to hear. They're expecting fireworks. She's going to play the angry black woman card. It wasn't said with malice, it was worse. It was said with boredom, as if it were obvious, routine, as if she were just the next black woman in a long line to be framed, provoked, and packaged for morning television drama. Jasmine heard every word. She didn't flinch, didn't turn. She let it settle, let it breathe. And then, without raising her voice, she spoke, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough that the entire room felt it in their bones. "If they brought me here expecting a performance," she said slowly, deliberately, "they're going to be shocked when the truth doesn't follow the script." Her tone was calm, almost gentle, but underneath it was iron. Years of being underestimated, misjudged, boxed in, and then told to smile for the cameras. She smiled now, but it was different. Not the kind of smile you wear to please. The kind you wear when you know exactly who you are, and you're done asking for permission to be it. Whoopi Goldberg sat at the center of the semicircle like she had 100 times before. Posture composed, face unreadable, tone soft but heavy with experience. The queen of daytime confrontation, the one who didn't need to shout to land a blow. Jasmine Crockett sat across from her, spine straight, expression calm, but her senses were sharp. Everything about the studio felt artificial, the lighting too perfect, the air too still, the smiles just a little too measured. They were mid-discussion, the kind of scripted warm-up where nothing too controversial gets said and nothing too real gets heard. Jasmine answered questions about her path into politics, how she balanced the demands of office, even cracked a light joke about sleepless nights. The audience chuckled. It all felt smooth, almost too smooth, the way a hallway does before a trap door opens. Jasmine had been in enough rooms to know when something was coming. And it was. The energy shifted, not with words, but with rhythm. Whoopi's gaze changed. She no longer looked at Jasmine as a guest, but as a target. The conversation slowed. The co-hosts felt quieter. There was a beat, a half-second of silence, that wasn't on the cue card. And then Whoopi leaned in, the way a prosecutor leans in before delivering a question designed not to clarify, but to corner. Her voice remained soft, steady, wrapped in practiced concern. "You're a lawyer," she began, her tone gentle, almost complimentary. "A congresswoman, a woman of color." She let each phrase land like a polished stone on the table, a setup dressed like respect. Her eyes stayed locked, her smile thin. Then came the shift, the blade hidden behind the velvet. "But do you ever think," she asked slowly, "maybe you're building a brand more than building real policy? That maybe you're using your identity more than your ideas?" The question fell into the room like a stone into still water. Quiet, heavy, intentional. And the ripples were immediate, not in sound, but in silence. The kind of silence that made producers lean forward in their chairs and camera operators hold focus an extra beat. The kind of silence that, if you listened closely, sounded like someone daring her to prove she belonged at that table in the first place. The applause came fast, loud, and almost mechanical, like muscle memory. Audience members clapped not just out of agreement, but out of expectation. This was The View, after all. They'd seen this play out before. A pointed question from Whoopi, a conservative or outsider fumbles, a few sound bites later, the moment goes viral. It was familiar, and they thought this would be no different. They believed the line had landed, that Jasmine had just been pinned to the wall by a question too sharp, too loaded, too public to escape. It wasn't just a question, it was the accusation behind it, that her identity wasn't earned but curated, that her power wasn't the result of grit and law and sleepless nights, but of marketing. They thought Whoopi had cornered her, and they were already applauding the takedown, but Jasmine didn't blink. She sat perfectly still, hands resting lightly on the table, her breathing steady. Not a single twitch of discomfort or anger in her face, not even a flicker. Where they expected offense, she offered silence. Where they expected fire, she offered stillness. And as the applause rolled over her like a wave she had already outgrown, she didn't rush to speak. She waited, letting the room burn off its adrenaline, letting the crowd reveal itself, not as an audience, but as a mirror. She had seen this performance before, just not always under studio lights. The moment when people cheer not for truth, but for confirmation. The moment when they reward the question that cuts, not the courage it takes to answer. It was an old rhythm, and she had outlived it. Then slowly, deliberately, she turned her head toward the camera. Not toward Whoopi, not toward the co-hosts, not toward the crowd. Straight into the lens, into the homes of millions watching from couches and break rooms and hospital beds, into the eyes of anyone who had ever been told their identity was a brand, their pain was a prop, or their existence was only allowed if it came with a smile. Her expression didn't change, her voice didn't rise, but what she said next hit with the force of a truth no one could clap away. "I don't carry my blackness as a weapon," she said, her tone calm but unshakably firm. "I carry it as a record of survival." The words didn't shout. They didn't need to. They sank, slowly, like something ancient and heavy, into the air and settled over the room like dust no one could brush off. They didn't demand a reaction. They stopped it cold. The applause died instantly, as if someone had cut the feed. The audience froze, not in disagreement, but in sudden, uncomfortable clarity. What she had said wasn't part of the narrative they came to see. It wasn't the angry outburst. It wasn't the defensive retreat. It was something far more dangerous. It was undeniable. In one sentence, she had stripped the room of its theater. She had taken a question designed to box her in and turned it into a statement too big to contain. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't polished for sound bites. It was raw, personal, true. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric. The kind of silence that comes when everyone realizes, all at once, that they've just heard something they can't unhear. That something in the room has shifted, and it's not going back. And no one, not even Whoopi, spoke next. The silence that followed Jasmine's words wasn't just still, it was sacred. Not a performance pause, not dead air. It was the kind of silence that happens in a courtroom when the verdict hits, or in a battlefield just before the smoke clears. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice, but somehow the room felt smaller now, tighter. She had thrown off the script, and everyone knew it. Even the applause sign in the studio seemed to flicker awkwardly, unsure whether it still had power. The audience looked toward Whoopi, waiting for her to bring the control back, to reframe the moment, to cut through the truth Jasmine had just dropped with something snappy, dismissive, familiar. But when Whoopi leaned forward again, it wasn't with ease. It was with edge. Her tone no longer wrapped in velvet. Her rhythm quickened. The gloves quietly had come off. "So you keep talking about discrimination?" Whoopi snapped, her voice harder now, stripped of diplomacy. "You say these things on every stage you get, but what are you doing to actually unite people? To build anything?" She didn't blink. "Because if all you offer is more division, how does that help the people you say you're fighting for?" It wasn't a question, it was a dare, delivered not just to challenge Jasmine's ideas, but to corner her character, as if to say, pain is real, but stop talking about it. Justice matters, but not if it makes others uncomfortable. And if your truth doesn't come with unity tied in a bow, we don't want it. The crowd shifted again, tension rising, not because Whoopi was right, but because she had drawn a line in the sand. And once again, all eyes turned to Jasmine, waiting to see if she would cross it. The question still lingered in the air like smoke. What does all this talk about discrimination actually do for the people? Jasmine didn't rush to respond. She didn't counterpunch. Instead, she took a slow breath, the kind you take when you know you're about to open a wound. Not yours, but one you've carried for someone else. Her tone shifted. No longer defensive, no longer rhetorical, just human. "Let me tell you a true story," she said, her voice steady but low. "A boy named Darnell, 14 years old, arrested in Dallas County for standing outside a gas station where something happened 10 minutes earlier. Wrong place, wrong time. No weapon, no stolen goods, no evidence. Just a black kid wearing a hoodie with no one to speak for him. She paused, not for drama, but for weight, the kind of pause that forced the room to hold its breath. They charged him with aggravated robbery. He kept saying he didn't do it, but it didn't matter. The court set his bail at $1,200. That's it, $1,200, not $10,000, not $1 million. Just enough to keep him locked up if his family couldn't find it. She looked around the studio now, not at the hosts, but at the audience, at the cameras, at the millions who would watch and maybe forget. And they couldn't. His mother worked 2 jobs, fast food and cleaning houses. His father was already gone. They tried, they begged, they called everyone they could think of, but the money never came. Her voice grew quieter, but somehow more powerful. So he sat in detention. Not for a few nights, not even a few weeks. 2 years. A child, 14, locked up for over 700 days without trial, without a conviction, because the law decided that poverty looked like guilt. Because in our system, innocence has a price tag, and he couldn't pay it. The silence in the room wasn't polite. It was heavy, a kind of shame that settled over the set like dust. No applause sign flashed. No one dared move. Then Jasmine leaned in just slightly and added, "So you ask me what talking about discrimination does? It reminds people that Darnell existed, that he mattered, that injustice isn't just a debate topic. It's a boy who missed his entire 9th grade year in a cell that smelled like bleach and concrete. And it's people like me who refuse to stop saying his name, who keep this country from pretending it never happened." And for a moment, even the cameras seemed afraid to blink. The air still hadn't moved since Jasmine finished Darnell's story. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just hold a room, it haunts it. No music, no cue, no words. Even the audience, trained over hundreds of episodes to laugh, clap, react on command, now sat unsure of themselves, as if reality had broken through the layers of television polish. Jasmine could feel it, the itch to pivot, to soften, to turn away from the truth she just laid bare. But she didn't give them that escape. She didn't reach for comfort. She didn't offer slogans or shift the topic to safer ground. Instead, she leaned in just slightly, her voice low but crystal clear, and asked not Whoopi, not the co-hosts, but the entire room, and beyond it, the nation watching live. If unity means silence in the face of injustice, then I choose to stand alone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The words hit harder because they were calm, unapologetic, certain, and suddenly everything in the room felt off balance. The lights too bright, the silence too thick. A few people in the audience began to clap, softly, uncertainly, like their hands were moving before their minds had caught up. Others looked around, unsure whether they were supposed to. This wasn't the response they were used to. This wasn't a punchline or a takedown or a scripted beat. It was raw truth, unfiltered, uncut, and most of all, inconvenient. The applause, if you could call it that, never gathered momentum. It stuttered, scattered. A few claps here, a few nods there, but nothing cohesive, nothing television-worthy. And that made it all the more powerful, because what Jasmine had done wasn't designed for applause. It wasn't meant to entertain. She had drawn a line in the sand, not for drama, but for conscience. And in doing so, she'd shifted the entire temperature of the room. What had begun as a performance was now something else entirely. Unpredictable, unrehearsed, real. Whoopi's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. Across the table, her co-hosts exchanged quiet, unsettled glances. Even the stage manager, usually so precise, so composed, hesitated with his cue cards, unsure if he was supposed to move forward or freeze, because this moment didn't fit the format. Jasmine Crockett hadn't followed the arc they were counting on. She wasn't playing the role of the outraged guest or the emotional politician. She was doing something far more dangerous. She was telling the truth and daring them to sit with it. The air in the studio had turned brittle, like glass waiting to crack. Jasmine's previous words still echoed in the silence, and for the first time, the momentum of the show was no longer in the hands of its veteran host. Whoopi Goldberg sat up straighter, her expression tightening. She'd lost the room once already, and she wasn't going to let it slip again. This wasn't just another guest with a message. This was someone reshaping the script in real time, and that was dangerous. So Whoopi struck harder, her voice now stripped of warmth, wrapped instead in the kind of sarcasm that cuts deep when spoken by someone with power. "And what exactly do you think you represent?" she asked, words sharp like broken glass. "You've been in Congress, what, a year?" She leaned forward, eyebrows raised. "This isn't Twitter. This is the real world." Laughter stirred faintly from the crowd, nervous, unsure, the kind that waits for permission to erupt but never quite gets it. The message was clear. Jasmine was young, untested, too loud, too bold, too early in her career to speak with so much authority. It wasn't just a challenge, it was a dismissal, a warning. Stay in your lane. Let the grown-ups talk. The blow wasn't about her policies, it was about her presence. The subtle suggestion that she was more performance than substance, more noise than knowledge, that her convictions were hashtags, not history, that her voice didn't belong in a room built by others. But Jasmine didn't look away. She didn't raise her voice or snap back. Her silence was not surrender. It was control. And when she did speak, it wasn't fast or defensive. It was slow, steady, like truth walking up the stairs while lies took the elevator. "I don't represent Twitter," she said, eyes steady, voice calm but sharp as steel. "I represent the mother who had her door kicked in at 5 in the morning while her kids were still asleep. I represent the woman who lost her home before the sun came up, while the morning news ran stories about celebrity divorces and pumpkin spice season, but never once mentioned her name. She let that hang there, not as a punchline, as a reality that rarely made it to daytime TV, a reality that didn't trend, but tore lives apart, a reality that too many people only acknowledged in private, behind closed doors, never under studio lights. And in that moment, Jasmine wasn't just answering Whoopi, she was rejecting the idea that visibility had to come with permission. She wasn't defending her time in Congress. She was defending the millions who never got 5 minutes in a room like this, and never would. The weight of Jasmine's words still hung thick in the air, like smoke refusing to clear. Her voice hadn't risen, but the atmosphere had. She had disarmed Whoopi's attack not with anger, but with something far more dangerous, truth spoken plainly. The audience sat motionless. Even the cameras seemed slower now, unsure whether they were still recording a talk show or a reckoning. Then, like someone yanking a fire alarm to break the tension, a co-host jumped in. Her voice was brighter, sharper, the tone of someone trying to reassert control, not just of the conversation, but of the narrative itself. "That's a powerful story," she said, smile tight, eyes narrowed. "But in reality, what have you actually done? I mean, stories are one thing, but have you even passed a single law?" The question sliced through the moment like cold steel. It wasn't curiosity. It was a rescue mission, an attempt to drag the show back onto its rails by framing Jasmine's conviction as empty rhetoric, as if impact could only be measured in bills passed through a broken Congress, as if the bar for worthiness was legislative math, not moral clarity. The implication was brutal but familiar. You talk a good game, but where are your wins? What have you actually changed? And just like that, the room braced itself again. All eyes turned to Jasmine, not to see if she had an answer, but to see if she'd crack under the pressure of being held to a standard that people like her were rarely allowed to set. The co-host's question still lingered in the air like a trap that had just been triggered. "Have you even passed a single law?" It was the kind of question that looked harmless on the surface, reasonable even, but everyone in the room could feel it land like a slap. Not because of what was asked, but how. The phrasing was surgical, measured. It didn't deny Jasmine's lived experience. It didn't argue her values. It did something quieter and colder. It diminished them. It reduced everything she'd said, the truths she laid bare, the voices she carried, into a scoreboard. Numbers, passed or failed, win or lose, as if the only thing that proved her value was how many bills bore her name. as if impact could only be validated by signatures and ink, as if the machinery of a deeply partisan, often paralyzed Congress could ever reflect the real worth of someone fighting for those who have no lobbyist. A few audience members shifted in their seats, unsure. Some nodded, some frowned. Others looked to Jasmine, waiting for the moment where maybe she'd finally stumble. Maybe this would be it, the line she couldn't cross, the proof she hadn't done enough. But Jasmine didn't look shaken. She didn't reach for talking points. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, with the same quiet determination she carried into every hearing room and late-night drafting session, she reached down beside her chair and pulled out a thick folder. Worn, bent, real. The kind of folder that had seen fluorescent committee lighting, been passed from staffer to staffer, and sat in unopened inboxes for months. She placed it gently on the table in front of her, letting the weight of it thud against the polished wood like a soft gavel. She opened it without theatrics. No grand reveal, no drama, just facts. Neatly tabbed and labeled. 17 separate legislative proposals, each one carefully structured, rooted in data, reviewed by teams of lawyers and policy staff. Bills she had written, sponsored, fought for, brought to the floor, or tried to. But none of them had passed. Not because they weren't viable, but because they were never given oxygen. Blocked in committee, buried in procedure. Killed by the slow, quiet violence of indifference. Housing equity for displaced families. Maternal health protections for Black mothers dying at 3 times the national rate. Bail reform for kids like Darnell. Environmental cleanup in rural towns where toxins outlive jobs. Accountability measures for local law enforcement. School funding, realignment. Clean water mandates for poison zip codes no one could find on a postcard. 17 times she had tried. 17 times the machinery had closed its ears. Jasmine didn't look angry. She looked tired and unshakably honest. She gestured toward the open folder with one hand, not for the cameras, but for the truth. And when she finally spoke, it was not defensive. It was steady, quiet, measured, like a final statement in a courtroom before the verdict. "I'm not lacking in effort," she said, looking straight ahead, not just at the co-host, but beyond her, into the audience, into the camera, into every voter who had ever been told they were asking for too much. Congress is just lacking ears to listen. There was no applause, no sudden gasp, just stillness. The kind of stillness that follows when someone says something so true, so plain, that there's nowhere left to hide behind the usual noise. Even the co-host, polished and poised, didn't move. She sat motionless, blinking once, then twice, as if realizing the questions she'd asked had just been turned into a mirror. Because Jasmine hadn't just answered the question, she had exposed the questioner. And beyond that, the broken system that asked survivors to prove their pain in policy briefs, that asked fighters to show receipts before it will hear their voices. In that moment, she wasn't pleading for respect. She was pointing to the proof and daring anyone to look away. The folder sat open, untouched, its contents now part of the air, thick, undeniable, and heavy. Jasmine's words still hung like a blade suspended mid-swing. Congress is just lacking ears to listen. It wasn't the volume of her voice that shook the studio. It was the finality in it, the way she didn't beg to be heard. She simply stated that she had spoken. The burden of listening now belonged to everyone else. Across the table, Whoopi Goldberg, usually sharp, quick, invincible, froze. Her pen, once casually flipping between her fingers, fell still. She glanced toward the producer's corner, then toward her cue card, as if searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. The reflex to push back was there, but it hit a wall of truth that could not be spun into daytime rhythm. Her brow furrowed, not with rage, but with recognition. Something had shifted. This wasn't just an exchange anymore. It was exposure. Next to her, the co-host who had fired the last question looked down, eyes fixed on the paper in front of her. She wasn't reading. She was retreating. The very script that had been designed to steer the conversation was now an anchor dragging against the weight of Jasmine's presence. Even her carefully practiced half-smile, polished from years on air, was gone. What replaced it was the expression of someone who realized Too late that the rules of engagement had been rewritten mid-show. And then came the camera sweep. Slow, methodical, almost cautious. The lens moved across the front row of the audience like a spotlight, unsure whether it should reveal or protect. The usual expressions, eager claps, smirks, whispered affirmations, were absent. Instead, still faces, hands clasped, shoulders stiff, eyes locked. Some viewers leaned forward slightly, not out of excitement, but tension. Others leaned back, brows knit, as if reevaluating what they thought they came to see. A few older men, silent until now, nodded slowly. Not in agreement with an argument, but in recognition of something truer than talking points. Something that reached beneath politics and touched something older, heavier, unshakable. And in that exact moment, when the air was thick enough to carve, when every mouth had gone dry, when even the studio lights seemed to dim just a little, Jasmine turned. She didn't turn toward Whoopi. She didn't look to the hosts. She turned straight to the camera. The lens found her, and she let it. No blinking, no pause. She stared down the barrel of that machine, knowing full well it was designed to control, to frame, to edit, to cut. But she refused to let it do any of those things. And then she said it, not in a roar, not with a flourish. She spoke it like a fact carved in stone. The truth cannot be silenced, no matter how many cameras you set or how many laughs you script. It wasn't a line for applause. It wasn't a viral mic drop. It was a warning. A warning to every executive in the control booth. A warning to every producer who thought they could package pain for ratings. A warning to every host who believed timing and tone were stronger than lived truth. And it was a vow that no matter how much they tried to twist the story, drown it in laughter, or cut it in post, they would not own the truth she had just spoken. Not today, not ever. The moment the studio lights dimmed, it was as if someone had lifted the lid off a pressure cooker. The audience dispersed, the hosts retreated behind their makeup mirrors, and producers tried to pretend everything had gone according to plan. But they all knew better. Something had broken, not in the set, not in the show, in the narrative. The show had ended, but the reckoning had just begun. At first, there was only silence, then a ripple. The clip didn't need editing. It didn't need music or overlays. Someone, likely a viewer watching from their kitchen table with a phone in hand and toast growing cold, had captured the moment Jasmine Crockett locked eyes with the camera and said, "The truth cannot be silenced, no matter how many cameras you set or how many laughs you script." The clip hit X, formerly Twitter, like a match in dry brush. Thousands watched, then tens of thousands, then millions. It wasn't just trending, it was erupting. People didn't share the video because they loved politics. They shared it because something in Jasmine's delivery bypassed their political fatigue. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't flinched, she hadn't begged to be believed. She had told the truth and dared the world to deny it. By noon, conservative talk shows were dissecting her every syllable, not to mock her, but to figure out how she had done what few had managed. She'd taken the high ground and set it on fire. One right-leaning host admitted, almost grudgingly, "I don't agree with a word of her policy, but damn it, she owned that room." Another commentator from a libertarian channel wrote simply, "Finally, someone who talks like she's not auditioning for power." On the other side, some liberal commentators fumbled. Jasmine didn't fit their mold. She was a Democrat, but she didn't play safe. She was a black woman, but she didn't allow herself to be categorized, softened, or controlled. Some pundits praised her courage. Others accused her of being divisive, the oldest trick in the book, and the laziest. But the public wasn't listening to the pundits anymore. They were watching her. And most surprising of all, the ones watching closest weren't the usual progressive audience. They were men, working class, middle-aged, disillusioned, the kind who rarely watched The View and never trusted its format. Truckers eating lunch in their cabs, vets flipping through channels in Virginia waiting rooms, factory workers on break scrolling through their phones, farmers whose radios played conservative talk all day. They weren't quoting legislation. They weren't debating platforms. They were asking a simple question, one after another, in forums, group chats, barbershops. Who is she? Not what party is she in? Not what's her voting record? Just, who is this woman who walked into a studio stacked against her and refused to bow her head? The answer for them wasn't about politics. It was about posture, about presence, about a kind of strength that didn't need to yell to be heard. One Vietnam vet from Montana wrote on a Facebook post that had been shared over 80,000 times. I don't care who she voted for. I care that she looked the machine in the eye and didn't blink. Another, a retired steelworker from Pittsburgh, commented under a news clip, haven't trusted a politician in 20 years. Don't know if I trust her yet, but I believe she believes what she's saying. That's a start. The mainstream press, desperate to keep pace, scrambled to catch the narrative. Some morning shows replayed the clip but added their own spin, softening the edges, layering it with commentary, trying to wrap Jasmine's conviction in digestible packaging. It didn't work. People weren't watching for analysis. They were watching for clarity, and she had given them that without needing anyone's permission. Cable news anchors tried to frame it as a political moment, but they missed the deeper truth. This wasn't about parties. This was about presence, about seeing someone on screen who didn't crumble under pressure, about seeing someone finally say what so many people had screamed into the dark for decades, that the system doesn't fail because we don't care. It fails because it never listens. That idea stuck. The algorithms noticed. Jasmine's face was everywhere. TikTok edits paired her voice with slow-motion overlays and swelling orchestral music. YouTube thumbnails showed her pointing calmly across the table, surrounded by stunned co-hosts. Reddit threads exploded with speculation. Would she run for Senate? Could she lead a movement? Was she the next face of generational truth-telling in a landscape addicted to image? But more quietly, and more powerfully, something else began. Conversations, real ones, in diners, in union halls, in online message boards that weren't meant for politics but suddenly couldn't ignore it. Men who had voted for Reagan, then Clinton, then Trump, found themselves watching that clip again. Not for what Jasmine said, but for how she said it. Calm, director, without apology. She's not the usual type, one retired postal worker wrote on a military forum, and maybe that's why she's dangerous to them. A bartender in Arkansas shared the clip with the caption, "My dad doesn't talk politics. Last night he asked me to look this woman up. That's never happened before." And the phrase began to form, quietly, repeated across state lines, whispered over backyard grills, typed in private text threads between men who didn't talk about politics because they didn't trust anyone in it. Maybe she's the only one who can face the whole damn system and not lose her calm. Not because she insulted the opposition, not because she won a debate, but because when the system tried to frame her, contain her, define her, she refused, and did it without breaking eye contact. What Jasmine did that day wasn't just clap back. She didn't play the media's game. She played her own. She rewrote the emotional rules of a platform designed to either uplift or destroy. And in doing so, she reached a part of the American psyche that had long grown numb. She reminded people what courage looked like when it didn't wear a cape. She reminded people that stillness, true, unmoved, unbought stillness, could be more powerful than a soundbite. And she did it while the cameras rolled, while the producers panicked, while the narrative tried to reshape itself in real time. No one quite knew what would happen next, but in that breathless aftermath, across living rooms and long-haul routes and faded union halls, something undeniable stirred. Not a revolution, not yet, but recognition. Recognition that in a political landscape littered with theatrics and sellouts, someone had walked into the lion's den, looked power in the face and said, "I see you, but you don't scare me." And that for the first time in a long time, made people believe that maybe, just maybe, truth was still possible on live television. The clip was still looping when the fifth person entered the room, clutching a folder that no one opened. On the screen, Jasmine Crockett stared into the lens with unnerving steadiness as her voice played back, flat and fierce. The truth cannot be silenced, no matter how many cameras you set or how many laughs you script. No one spoke. No one dared. It was the fourth time they'd watched that exact 30-second segment. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and nervous deodorant. The usual buzz of post-production chatter was gone, replaced by an invisible fog of disbelief and tightening throats. These were professionals, most of them with 2 decades of television under their belts. They had survived wardrobe malfunctions, on-air protests, even lawsuits from sitting senators. But this was different. "This wasn't the show," said Diane Renner, VP of Segment Strategy. She stood with her arms crossed, her knuckles pale against the cuffs of her gray blazer. "This wasn't the guest we booked." Across the table, Dan Hollister, executive producer of The View for the past 7 years, leaned forward with elbows on the oak grain. "She didn't go off script," he said, his voice low, almost numb. "She rewrote the script." A chuckle escaped from someone in the back. Nervous, awkward. No one acknowledged it. The president of daytime programming, Conrad Ellis, exhaled sharply through his nose. "The hell's that supposed to mean?" Dan didn't look up. "We built a machine, a rhythm. Conservative guests come in, they argue, they defend, they get rattled, the panel pushes back, audience claps, viral moment, done. It's performance. Predictable. She didn't play her part." Conrad slammed a hand lightly against the table. Not angry yet, but frustrated by the language. "So what? She was boring." "No," Dan said, finally looking up. "She was undeniable." The word hung in the air like a bell tone that wouldn't stop ringing. At the far end of the table, Olivia Chen, social engagement director, flipped her iPad around for everyone to see. "We're at 12.4 million views across TikTok, X, and YouTube Shorts in under 10 hours. Comments are 78% positive. That's unheard of." "Positive?" Diane frowned. "From who?" Olivia swiped. "Veterans groups, independents, blue-collar pages in Ohio, Missouri, Kansas." Also trending in Canada for some reason, someone called her the steel spine of Texas. Conrad rubbed his temples. "Christ." "What's the real issue here?" asked Brad Jansen, a legal rep from Standards and Practices, his voice oozing with calm control. "That she did too well? That people liked it? That they listened," Diane snapped. Everyone turned to her. "She cracked something open," she said, pacing slightly now. "She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult anyone. She never lost control. And somehow it made our people look like they did. That clip doesn't look like a debate. It looks like an intervention." Silence returned. A junior producer in the corner, Max, barely 30, cleared his throat. "We thought we invited the viral firebrand. You know, Twitter wars, snappy comebacks, big earrings and bigger volume." "She wore no makeup," Diane said. "She wore a pin of her grandmother," Olivia added. Conrad's brow furrowed. "So what the hell do we do?" "Damage control," Brad said quickly. "Spin," Dan countered. "But subtle." "No," Olivia said firmly. "Anything we say will backfire. She's not trending because she won an argument. She's trending because people think we lost the right to question her." Conrad blinked. "Is that what this is about now? Rights?" "No," Dan said. "It's about recognition. She told the truth, and people could feel it." The screen behind them flickered as the clip restarted. Jasmine again. That stare, that stillness, that line. "The truth cannot be silenced." "People think we ambushed her," Olivia said softly. Conrad gestured vaguely. "Didn't we?" That question, unspoken until now, cut through the air like a blade. Dan didn't answer. He didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew what The View had become over the years. A comfortable machine built on chaos and control. They brought in conflict like seasoning, pre-measured and safely packaged. No one was ever truly destroyed. They were managed. Guests were either allowed to soften their image or set themselves on fire. Jasmine Crockett, however, had done neither. She had absorbed the setup and dismantled it from within. "I thought Whoopi was supposed to own that room," Max said quietly, instantly regretting it. "She usually does," Dan replied. "But she blinked," Olivia finished. They all remembered it. That half second when Whoopi looked down, eyes unfocused. A blink that lasted a heartbeat too long. A visible stumble from someone who never stumbled. the moment the room had shifted. And now, the audience wasn't talking about the view. They were talking about Jasmine. Outside the building, news vans had started circling, hoping for a statement. Inside, the emails kept piling in. Viewers who had been loyal to the show for years were sending something ABC hadn't expected. Not complaints, but questions. Why had Jasmine been treated like a disruption instead of a guest? Why hadn't the panel listened? And, most dangerous of all, why did she seem like the only honest person in the room? That last question repeated itself across Facebook threads and Reddit forums like a quiet rebellion. She didn't look like she was selling anything. She didn't try to be charming. She looked like she was standing in fire and didn't move. Every word built on the next, forming something no programming algorithm could predict. A groundswell. A memory. A shift. Conrad leaned back, suddenly tired. "Do we bring her back?" Dan almost laughed. "You think she'd come?" "No," Diane said. "But I think America just might follow her out the door." The silence returned. Only this time, it felt final. No decisions were made that day. No PR campaigns launched. No official statements released. Because deep down, everyone in that room knew what had happened, and worse, what couldn't be undone. They hadn't just platformed a guest, they had aired a mirror, and for the first time in a long time, people were looking. In a truck stop diner just outside of Topeka, Kansas, the clip played for the third time on an old mounted TV above the pie counter. The screen was cracked in the corner, and the closed captions struggled to keep up with the video. Still, no one spoke. No one touched their coffee. 3 men sat at the counter, one in a camouflage jacket that hadn't seen a deer in years, one in a Ford mechanic coverall, and one in an old veteran's baseball cap that had been restitched too many times to count. They weren't friends, not really. They just knew each other's names, sat in the same seats every week, and shared the same fatigue carved into their jawlines. But that morning, they were united by something far more rare than habit. Jasmine Crockett was on the screen, and they were listening. It was the moment again. That line. The truth cannot be silenced, no matter how many cameras you set or how many laughs you script. The mechanic leaned forward, elbows on Formica. She wasn't scared. The man in the camo nodded slowly, still watching the replay. She wasn't selling anything either. No one replied right away. They didn't need to. What they were witnessing wasn't normal, and they knew it. They'd watched 100 political interviews, most of them performative, smug, angry, empty. But this wasn't that. This was a woman standing in the belly of a media beast designed to mock and misrepresent her, and she didn't just survive. She held the damn line. "She reminds me of my old CO in '71, the vet said finally, voice low. "She didn't shout. She just gave you that look like, 'I'll walk into hell if I have to, but I'm not blinking.' That kind of look." Across America, scenes like this unfolded in places where political opinions had hardened like concrete decades ago. But Jasmine wasn't cracking the walls with ideology. She was whispering something more disruptive: conviction. In a worn-down Union Hall in Youngstown, Ohio, 7 retirees sat beneath a dusty American flag, watching the segment replay on YouTube. No talking heads, no analysis, just raw footage. "I hated that show," one of them muttered. "Still do." "Then why we watching it?" someone else asked. "'Cause she's not them," came the answer. In Arkansas, a high school janitor in his 60s pulled out a burner phone during break and replayed the moment for a younger teacher. "You want to know what courage looks like?" he asked. "This, right here." In Tennessee, in a barbershop that doubled as a debate club on Saturdays, 3 older black men and 2 white farmers from the edge of town found themselves nodding at the same timestamp. Jasmine staring dead into the camera, saying not a single extra word, just, "I'm not here for applause. I'm here because silence helps no one." That was the moment the applause track in their heads shut off. That was the moment they stopped seeing a Democrat or a black woman or a politician and started seeing something closer to what they had forgotten. Someone who had nothing left to prove, but still chose to speak. It wasn't a policy proposal that moved them. It was the posture, the stillness, the steel, the refusal to be edited. Most of these men had never voted the same way twice. Some had stopped voting altogether. They didn't wear slogans. They didn't share articles. They didn't comment on political posts. But that week, they did one thing they hadn't done in years. They hit replay, not once, not twice, but over and over. And with each replay, something subtle shifted. Not their entire worldview, not their party loyalty, but their ears. They were open. Their eyes, they were sharper. The cynicism that had calcified over the years, fed by broken promises and empty sound bites, didn't vanish, but it cracked. Just enough to let in a question: could she be real? In a dusty garage in rural Montana, two brothers who hadn't spoken since the 2020 election sat side by side for the first time in years, both watching Jasmine's segment separately on their phones until one said, "You seen this?" And the other replied, "Yeah, she ain't like the rest of them." And that was the thing. Jasmine Crockett wasn't asking them to like her. She wasn't even asking them to agree. She simply stood her ground, said what needed saying, and didn't flinch when the room turned hostile. That made her dangerous. Not to the men watching, but to the system they'd grown to resent. The usual weapons didn't work on her. She wasn't loud, so she couldn't be accused of yelling. She wasn't vague, so she couldn't be spun. She wasn't fragile, so pity had no place. And when Whoopi had launched the usual attacks, accusations of divisiveness, privilege, inexperience, Jasmine had met them with lived truth, not rehearsed rebuttals. That, to the men watching, was familiar. It was the same way their fathers used to talk when they came home from the factory. Quiet, direct, bone-tired of BS. "She ain't performing," one ex-coal miner from West Virginia wrote in a Facebook comment. "She testifying." And others echoed him. "She talks like someone who's been through it. She reminds me of the nurse who fought to keep my wife on a transplant list. She ain't trying to be liked. She's just not afraid of being hated." For a generation of men taught to grit their teeth and bury pain, Jasmine's stillness wasn't weakness. It was command. For decades, they'd been told to vote for anger, or for charm, or for fear. But now, they were watching someone speak with none of those masks. In a small coffee shop in Reno, a group of truckers rotated through their stops, and one guy left his phone on the counter. The clip autoplayed. The barista, a woman in her 50s, looked up at the screen, then turned to the counter. "She say that just like that?" The trucker nodded. Didn't blink once. Back at the diner in Kansas, the mechanic finally broke the silence again. "You think she'll run for president?" The vet chuckled. "I don't think they'd let her." "Then maybe it's time someone didn't ask for permission." The man in the camo coat sipped his coffee and stared back up at the screen, now paused on Jasmine's face. A still image, but somehow more alive than most speeches ever given. "She didn't ask to lead," he said. "Yeah," the vet muttered, finishing his cup, "but I'd follow her anyway." The first time it happened, it barely registered. A conservative morning radio show out of Des Moines opened its 6 a.m. segment with a quote they had never aired before. Not Reagan, not Trump, not some viral talking point from Turning Point USA. Just a voice, Jasmine's, clipped from her appearance on The View. "I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to look around and ask yourself who's profiting from the silence." There was no editorial, no snide remark, no canned laughter, just the quote, followed by 30 full seconds of dead air. In talk radio, silence is death. But here, it was respect. Callers lit up the board. "Who was that? Was that the woman from The View? She didn't sound like a Democrat. She sounded like someone who's been lied to, same as the rest of us." By the time the host came back on, he didn't even need to comment. The audience was already processing what the producers hadn't expected. An instinctive, almost tribal recognition of truth. Not partisan truth, not the kind that fits neatly in a tweet. Something older, grittier, human. "She talked like my sister used to before the pills took her," one caller said, like she remembered what struggle felt like. That moment was the start, but it wasn't the end. Within 48 hours, a libertarian podcast in Idaho opened with the same clip. Then a military veteran channel in Kentucky reposted it, calling her a public servant with grit. A populist farming collective in Nebraska added subtitles in Spanish and English and reposted it to their 75,000 followers, captioning it, "Real recognizes real." By the end of the week, one of the most unlikely endorsements came from a retired Tea Party strategist on a live YouTube stream. "I don't care what side she's on. If she can walk into a studio like that, get ambushed, and leave with the room in her hand, that's a leader." Period. Mainstream political consultants were baffled. They ran the numbers over and over again. She hadn't changed policy positions. She hadn't softened her tone. She hadn't worn red, white, and blue on her sleeve. And yet her clip was performing better among independents and center-right audiences than it was among left-wing circles. Why? Because she didn't ask anyone to like her. She just stood still while everyone else flinched. And that kind of power doesn't belong to a party. It belongs to history. In Arizona, a former Border Patrol agent who'd voted Republican his entire life posted a screen recording of Jasmine's line. "If unity means silence in the face of injustice, then I'll walk alone." He didn't write a caption. Just let the video speak. It got 600,000 shares in 3 days. In Detroit, a group of auto workers stitched her words into a TikTok set against black and white footage of factory layoffs. The top comment read, "She didn't talk policy. She talked pain." And in Georgia, a small-town preacher read her quote aloud from the pulpit, without attribution. Only later did one of his parishioners tell him who said it. He paused, then nodded slowly. God doesn't check party registration before he anoints a truth-teller. That was the moment the narrative cracked. She wasn't being seen as one of theirs, or the opposition. She was being heard as one of us, a mirror, not a messenger, a reminder, not a reformer. And that terrified the media industrial complex more than any poll ever could. On MSNBC, anchors were split. Some hailed her as the next generation of progressive leadership. Others were more cautious. "She didn't defend party policy," one analyst noted. "She defended moral clarity." That's not always the same thing. At Fox News, the confusion was more visceral. Some talking heads called her manipulative. Others tried to paint her as part of the woke machine. But those narratives struggled, because the clip told its own story. No editing, no flashy graphics. Just Jasmine, unmoved, refusing to play victim, and refusing to be made a villain. Even in echo chambers designed to prevent perspective, cracks formed. Because when a voice resonates that deeply, it doesn't knock. It enters uninvited. In a small church in Alabama, a men's Bible study group met for their usual Friday circle. They'd spent years arguing over politics, often angrily, sometimes bitterly. But that week, someone brought a laptop, played the clip. The room was silent afterward. One man who'd never said much before finally murmured, "I don't agree with all she said, but I believed every word of it." Another nodded. "So did I, and I ain't believed a politician in 20 years. They didn't change party. They didn't switch teams. But they remembered what it felt like to believe something again. And that, more than any donation, endorsement, or tweet, was power. Real power. Jasmine herself said nothing during that week. She didn't thank her followers. She didn't quote tweet the praise. She didn't post filtered selfies or do Instagram lives explaining what it all meant. She stayed quiet, grounded, focused. When pressed by a local reporter outside her district office about the viral wave, she simply said, "I'm not flattered. I'm just glad people are listening." Listening, not cheering, not agreeing, not weaponizing, just listening. Because Jasmine Crockett had done what no strategist could plan, what no media consultant could script, what no billionaire could buy. She had stepped into a place designed to erase her and left a burn mark that wouldn't fade. Not because she fought harder, but because she stood truer. And now across the country, people from every political direction were asking the same dangerous question. If she's telling the truth, what else have we not been hearing? In Washington, consultants panicked. Lobbyists recalculated. Party officials whispered her name not with admiration, but with caution. She was unpredictable. She was uncontrollable. And worst of all, she was believable. And for the first time in years, believability was crossing party lines like wildfire across dry grass. The headlines faded. The algorithms recalibrated. Other faces filled the screens. But something about Jasmine Crockett's appearance on The View refused to die. It lingered. Not as a clip or a meme or a talking point, but as a fracture. A quiet, spreading fracture in the polished veneer of media performance, political calculation, and cultural cynicism. Because Jasmine hadn't just disrupted a TV segment, she had broken a spell, the spell that told Americans they couldn't trust their own instincts, that only the loudest deserved the mic, that outrage was authenticity, that identity was agenda, that silence was strategy. She shattered all of that with a look, a line, and a stillness so grounded it unnerved even seasoned professionals. And as that stillness echoed beyond the studio walls, it began asking a different kind of question, not about who was right or wrong, but about who was willing to pay the cost of telling the truth. The lesson wasn't buried in a soundbite. It couldn't be, because the people who needed to hear it most weren't scrolling for slogans. They were watching with crossed arms, tired eyes, and a lifetime of being let down. In her refusal to shout, Jasmine shouted something deeper. That dignity doesn't require permission. That courage isn't measured by applause. And that truth doesn't ask for a stage. It demands one. Across the country, people who never commented suddenly spoke. Fathers who had never cried suddenly said, "That part got me." Teachers shared the clip between classes. Mechanics texted it to their sons. Ministers quoted it on Sunday without ever saying her name. Not out of disrespect, but reverence. Because what she had done couldn't be reduced. It couldn't be spun. It was too real. And here was the realest part. Jasmine didn't walk into that studio to make a statement. She walked in because she had carried too many names. Names that would never make the news. Names that died behind bars, in evictions, in silence. She had walked through halls where bills were buried before the ink dried, where justice wore a tie and a grin, and where truth had to beg for airtime. She didn't want the spotlight, but she knew how to survive it. And what she delivered in that moment wasn't defiance, it was deliverance. A reminder that sometimes someone has to refuse to kneel to the choreography of a system designed to humiliate them. That was the lesson. You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to win to be right. You don't have to be accepted to matter. Because power doesn't always come from popularity. Sometimes it comes from persistence, from presence, from pain, harnessed like steel, not to hurt others, but to hold ground that no one else will. And Jasmine held that ground with every syllable, every pause, every story she brought into a room built to erase them. They wanted her to play a part. She chose to write a different ending. And in doing so, she reminded us that authenticity is not a performance. It is a posture. In a world full of cameras, she made eye contact with the country and didn't flinch. She stared into the machine and made the machine blink. That's not politics. That's prophecy. And it's why, long after the media moved on, the echo remained. Because the truth, once seen, can't be unseen. It doesn't fade when the segment ends. It grows roots. And Jasmine's words had taken root in places the media rarely visits. In tired living rooms, on late-night commutes, in church basements and prison libraries and back porches where people still talk with conviction. She reached the kind of Americans who don't ask for change because they've learned not to expect it. But when they heard her speak, they sat up straighter. Because she wasn't just speaking to cameras. She was speaking for someone who's been waiting years for a representative to say, "This is unjust, and I won't pretend otherwise." That was her rebellion, not rage, not rhetoric, just honesty so clean it sliced. And that's what made her dangerous. Not to the people, but to the pretense, to the illusion that politics is only for the polished, that power is only for the proven, that dignity is something you earn after playing the game. Jasmine played no game, and yet she won the moment, not with aggression, with grace, and that grace, under fire, under scrutiny, under attack, wasn't just rare, it was unforgettable. So what's the lesson? The lesson is that truth still works, that conviction still lands, and that a single voice, unapologetic, uncoached, unbroken, can realign a conversation more than a million retweets. The lesson is that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, but stillness in the face of noise is power. Jasmine didn't need to convert everyone. She didn't need to trend. She needed only to remind the country there is still something worth believing in. There is still such a thing as earned trust. And there are still moments when a woman standing tall in hostile space can change everything. Not by fighting louder, but by refusing to bow. That is not just a story. That is a warning and a hope. Because if one woman can do that with nothing but her voice and her spine, what could 1,000 do? What could a nation do? The system may forget. The show may move on. But we remember. Not the debate, not the drama. The moment. The moment she said, "I don't carry my skin like a weapon. I carry it like a witness." And every man, woman, and child who has ever been silenced felt seen. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.